Okay, well, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Well, this is my, at least for second time, I think, at the Bakers Union. Last time was, I think, at Bridlington many years ago. But thanks very much for having me back. And let me start by congratulating the union on its centenary. I think for people outside the union looking in, it would be fair to say that this union in particular is recognized throughout the union, throughout the movement, as being an effective and progressive and independent union, which gives a loud voice to workers in the food industry generally. So our congratulations from the Institute for the work that you do. The other thing I would say is that the union has been recognized as effective industrially. Someone said to me this morning that this is one of the bravest unions in relation to the 0 Hours campaign. And it's also been very effective politically, including, in particular, the work which you've done with the Labour Party radically to transform, come up with proposals that will transform trade union and employment rights. So I think, when you work within the union, it's very hard sometimes to see the impact that your work does. But coming from outside, looking in, I can say to you that this union plays a big part, both industrially, leading the way on important campaigns, and politically leading the way within the Labour Party in terms of developing a new progressive agenda for a future Labour government. So what I want to do, just very briefly, because I know you've got a busy agenda, and I don't want to add to any sore heads that there might be in the hall this morning. I just want to say something about some of the political campaigns that the union has engaged with. And one of these relates to the campaigns by the Institute of Employment Rights. And together with the trade union movement, we have developed this manifesto for labour law. And this manifesto for labour law has been adopted by the Labour Party. It formed the basis of Labour's election manifesto at the last general election. And we're working now with Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and with others to implement the contents of the manifesto. So the manifesto itself contains, there are 25 key recommendations. I'm not going to deal with them all. What I want to do is just to focus on 3 of these provisions, which I think are particularly relevant to where we are today. And so the first of these is really just to try to engage support with this. The first is the suggestion or the proposal that there should be a new government department to drive through a new agenda for a progressive labour law and for progressive employment rights. And this cannot, under a Labour government, be left to the business department. Workers' rights cannot be an issue for the Department for Business as it was under Blair and Brown. What we need is a new Ministry of Labour to advance the cause of workers' rights generally. Now, if you look around the world, you'll see that other countries, this is not a particularly radical idea, though it does have radical implications, but if you look around the world, most other countries have a government department which is dedicated to represent the interests of workers in government, but not in this country. There are 31 million workers in the United Kingdom. There is not a government minister who is responsible to represent the interests of these workers in government. So what we are saying is that the first thing Corbyn should do on election is to create a new department that will represent us at the cabinet table in government. And part of the responsibility of that new government should be to develop or to implement a progressive programme for the expansion of collective bargaining. And that, I think, so the second thing first is a new department, but secondly, with a key responsibility to promote the expansion of collective bargaining. And why is that important? Well, when I started work in 1978 as a young man, when I joined the labour force then, there were 82% of British workers were covered by a collective agreement. That's 4 out of every 5 workers. When we look today at the figures that were released last week by the government about collective bargaining coverage, that has fallen to about 30%. So we're now looking at about 3 out of every 10 workers covered by a collective agreement. And that, I think, is probably an exaggeration. It exaggerates the level of the coverage because other figures suggest that bargaining levels, because of austerity over the last 10 years, have fallen to about 20%. 2 out of every 10 workers, 1 out of every 5 covered by a collective agreement, compared to when I started, when it was 4 out of 5 workers. Now that's got to change. And the reason why that's significant is because international studies show that the higher the level of collective bargaining coverage, the greater the level of equality there will be in any society. The lower the level of coverage, the higher the levels of inequality there will be. And one thing what has happened since I started work in 1978 has been this massive expansion in the levels of inequality in the United Kingdom. And that is tied very, very closely to the levels of collective bargaining decline. So the second thing for Corbyn, one is to put in place the infrastructure, the department that's going to do this, but the second thing is to rebuild the collective bargaining coverage that once existed in this country. And the way to do that really is to do what we did in the past, which is to rebuild the sector-wide collective bargaining structures that once operated to guarantee that every worker in this country would be covered by a collective agreement. And what we are proposing is that every worker should be covered by a collective agreement, and the way to do that is to reintroduce sector by sector, industry by industry, collective bargaining methods, so that trade unions sit down with groups of employers to negotiate the collective agreement for the industry or the sector in question. So if companies come here, and McDonald's or anybody else want to operate in this country, the first thing they have to do is to ensure that they comply with the collective agreement which operates in the sector in question, whether it be the food sector or whatever other sector that we create for this purpose. So that is the second thing that we are proposing should happen, a massive expansion of collective bargaining coverage to get us back to where we were in the 1970s and indeed in the many years before, in order, not just in the interest of trade unions, but in order to expand the levels of equality which should operate in a civilized society. And the third thing that we're proposing, just a third theme, if I could touch on this, is the need to have effective employment rights. And when we're talking about effective employment rights, we're talking about 3 things. One is that there should be universal application. If you're a worker, you should be covered by employment law. So we get away with these false distinctions in our employment legislation between people who are employees, you get certain rights. If you're a worker, you get other rights. If you're self-employed, you get fewer rights still. What we're saying, anybody who works for a living is entitled to the labour standards which the state guarantees. And we just get rid of all these false distinctions. Secondly, we say there should be an abolition by legislation of 0 hours contracts. And that's, we've already drafted a bill, and we're happy to circulate the bill on how you abolish 0 hours contracts. It was actually drafted for an SNP backbencher, a guy called Chris Stevens, earlier this year. And what we say in the bill is that every employer should guarantee to every worker guaranteed minimum working hours every week. And that should be set out clearly in the terms of your contract. Anything beyond that, if the employer wants people to work more than the guaranteed minimum, that can only be done with consent, and there will be penalty rates which the employer would have to provide at 150% or 200% of the normal wage, which would be set out, by the way, in a collective agreement, as well as, of course, the fallback in the national living wage. Now, it's only if we, in a sense, take this problem seriously by legislation that we're going to eliminate this problem. And the way to do this, we think, is by actually imposing an obligation on the employer in relation to every worker to guarantee a standard minimum working hours. It's the employer's responsibility to determine how many workers the employer needs and how these workers are to be engaged on a weekly basis. We get away from the culture of treating workers like commodities to be used and abused at the discretion of the employer. And the third thing, apart from universal application, abolition of zero-hours contracts, the third thing is to have a proper system for the enforcement of labour rights. And so what we're suggesting is that there should be less reliance on employment tribunals. People get drawn into a system which is complex, stressful, and expensive. There should be more reliance on industry procedures developed through sector-wide collective agreements, and more reliance still on an independent labour inspectorate system which is financed and maintained by the Ministry of Labour, which we are proposing Corbyn should establish on day one of a new Labour government. So there is, in a sense, these are some of the proposals that we're working on with Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, to try to develop a more progressive employment rights package in which trade unions will be more centrally embedded in the economic life of the nation. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking you, this union, for providing support for this work, which I think will be transformative if a Labour government is elected. We look forward to working with you on this campaign over the next few years and into the life of a Labour government. Buy the manifesto, get free copies of the manifesto, circulate the manifesto, spread the ideas, and we look forward also to the next 100 years of the Bakers Union, though sadly we won't be here to celebrate it with you, but most of you won't be here either. But hopefully 100 years from now we'll be living in a much more progressive world in which the rights of trade unions and workers are much more clearly embedded and taken for granted in the lives of our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.